This week's episode is sponsored by Electric Collab, a psychology-based branding and web design studio that positions founders to win more premium clients with a brand they're wildly proud of. If you want to serve a premium audience, you need brand messaging, design, and a digital presence that reflects the elevated quality of your work. Spoiler alert, Electric Collab is my brand studio. So if a rebrand has been in your mind, I would love to meet you. Learn more by visiting electriccollab.com. Now on to the episode. Welcome to Curious Life of a Child-Free Woman. I'm Emily Paulsen, and October is my favorite month of the year. The air feels crisper, the nights grow longer, and there's a certain magic in this season that makes anything feel possible. This month, our conversations take on that same spooky energy. We're going to play with mystery, celebrate the unusual, and find meaning in the things that spark our imagination. If one episode a week isn't enough for you, you will find a special Halloween bonus waiting on Substack. For now, let's dive into this season and see where our curiosity takes us. When we hear the word witch, a lot of images come to mind. Halloween, hocus pocus, broomsticks, and fairy tales. But behind those images is a very real and complicated history. Here in the States, our perception of witches is often tied to the infamous Salem Witch Trials of 1692, when fear and suspicion tore through a community and changed the course of American history. The more I've learned about this, the more I realize these accusations often fell on women who rebelled against the status quo and decided not to conform to what their community expected. Today's guest, Rachel Christ-Doane, is the Director of Education at the Salem Witch Museum. I am so excited to have her here with us. She has dedicated her work to uncovering the truth of what really happened in Salem and helping us understand why these stories still hold so much power. Rachel is here to help us separate fact from fiction and explore what the trials can teach us about fear, power, and belonging even today. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Okay, I am fascinated by this topic and I want to explore all of the nuance of what was going on. But can you start by painting a picture? What was happening? What did life look like in the 1690s in Massachusetts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the most mystifying elements of this subject is when we first start talking about it, it seems very unfamiliar. 1690 Salem, Massachusetts, that's such a different time from today, right? They don't have indoor plumbing, they don't have electricity. It's a very different world. But with that being said, I'm sure we'll talk about a lot today is when you start to really dig deep into it, a lot of the same challenges they're experiencing are challenges we still face today. A lot of what's going on are still emotions and human reactions we experience today. So I always think that's an important thing to frame these conversations with is that reminder to strip away the centuries we feel a major difference between us. But of course, it is a different time. So just to give us a broad sense of what it's like to be living in the 1690s in Massachusetts, I'm sure if we think back to our middle school history classes, right, we'll remember Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded by the Puritans. So primarily, this is a group of people coming from England. They are practicing a form of Christianity known as Calvinism, which is a more extreme version of the Protestant religion that's being practiced back home in England. Where the Puritans get their name is they've been trying to purify the Church of England, strip it of some of the excesses they see. And now they've gone off to the New World to set up what they see as a city upon a hill. They think of the colony as this example for all of Christendom of how to do Christianity right, in quotation marks. They are going to create a special relationship with God and create this godly colony and make sure everybody's following rules that align with the teachings of the Bible, and they will be rewarded for this effort. So the stakes are very high in the colony. They have these really lofty goals for themselves, and this is starting to break down by the 1690s. For a combination of reasons, we'll just touch on it very quickly because nobody wants a detailed 17th century socio-political lesson. But basically, the king in England has had enough by the 1680s. He's saying, Massachusetts, you guys are way too independent. I don't like what I'm seeing. He revokes their charter, which basically is the foundation of the colony. It's their legal system. It's how their courts operate. It's their property laws. And it's their Puritan core. The charter is what is the legal document that says you can be a Puritan colony. The king takes it away, and there's just chaos. This happens in the early mid 1680s. And now the colony is in the state of, what is our legal system going to look like? Can we elect our own officials? What do our laws look like? Do we still own the land we've been tilling for generations? And there's a huge spiritual crisis. Will we continue to be a Puritan colony? And that's just the big stuff. There's outbreaks of smallpox. There's been some earthquakes. So it's a period of escalating fear and tension on a large scale. And then when you zoom into Salem, there's internal political problems. There's fighting about who the minister should be of Salem Village, who's basically going to run Salem Village. Salem Village is what is today the modern town of Danvers, whereas Salem Town is the modern city of Salem. So they're trying to separate from each other. It's all this anxiety that's just building and building and building. And it's a very uncertain time for the common person.
I'm glad you started with reminding us that maybe we're not so different, because a lot of that sounds familiar. I feel like there's a lot of unrest, a lot of division, which leads to fear and suspicion and all these things. Okay, so I'm visualizing this. I'm picturing what's going on, and tensions are rising. People are getting nervous. How does witchcraft become part of this? Is witchcraft a thing that's out there in the culture that people are talking about already, or do they invent this as a concept? How does that come in?
Yeah, so this is another element of the worldview of all people in Europe and the European colonies at this point. Witchcraft is something that has existed. And when we say existed, we mean the belief in witchcraft has existed for centuries by the Salem Witch Trials. There have been witch trials going on in Europe for centuries, literally. The witch trials in Europe really start in earnest in the 1400s. And some of the worst panics happen in the mid to late 1500s. So Salem actually is happening towards the end of the witch trials period. Witchcraft becomes decriminalized increasingly in the 1700s. So it's really squeaking in at the end there. So when we say witch, right, it's very different from what we imagine today. So a witch at this time, the period being what's referred to as the early modern period. Throughout this time, a witch is defined as a person, an ordinary person who had sold their soul to the devil. And in return, it was believed they gained supernatural powers that could be used to cause all kinds of misfortunes. For example, your child suddenly becomes sick, your cow drops dead, your crops suddenly fail, the weather shifts, and your crops die. Those kinds of unexplainable misfortunes were often blamed on the work of a witch, particularly if you had recently had an argument with someone or you had had an encounter with someone that rubbed you the wrong way. You might start to wonder, was that person actually a witch? And my misfortune is now caused by that person's malevolent witchcraft. They've been tricked and tempted and seduced by the devil. And we should remember, witches could be anyone. So there is a usual suspect, which I'm sure we'll talk about in some depth today, but all people could be suspected of being witches. Men, women, children, people who were very rich and in the upper stratas of society, people who were very poor and the lower strata. There are witch panics where the majority of those accused are men. That happened very infrequently, but it did happen. Contrary to popular belief, there's a very famous panic that happens in Iceland that targets almost exclusively men. There's a few women, but majority are men. So all this to say, it's a very big topic, and it's basically an enemy hiding in plain sight. Witches can look like anyone, they can be anyone, they can be hiding anywhere, and they can explain anything. So this is the context of Salem in the 1690s, where people very much believed that if something bad happened to you or happened to your family, it could be the work of the witch. And then on top of that, they have all these lofty Puritan goals, these religious goals, where they think that they're this special Puritan, special religious colony that's got this special relationship with God. So because of that, the devil's really going to want to come after them. And they've been warned about this for years, that the devil and his army could be coming at any time, and be ready when they do. So that's where we are in the 1690s.
How did they get this idea associated with witches that you sell your soul to the devil, this dark side of this? Because I have a couple friends now in 2025 who identify as witches. And to them, And they say this in, I think, Practical Magic. There's no darkness in the craft, right? It's about a connection to Mother Earth, and they open things with earth, fire. There's nothing satanic about it. So who came up with this idea that witches and the devil go together?
Well, I think it's actually easier for us to understand it in terms of modern witches are doing something very different from the origins of the crime of witchcraft. The first time we're hearing the word witch being used in Europe. There has always been a belief in magic, in being able to use forces of the world around you, being able to tap into the universe, right? We should note that the history of magic and medicine go very closely hand in hand. So people believed if you did X, Y, and Z, you could cure an illness, you could find a lost object, you could promote fertility, you could find love, things like that. That was around centuries before witch trials began. And it's something that gets picked back up in the modern day, in the 20th century specifically. And people start to draw on the lessons of witch trials, combining them with these older earth based magical traditions. And we get an entirely different version of the witch. The origins of the European witch is a subject of extensive scholarship. It's very complicated, and without going too deep into it, it's basically as Christianity begins, there are centuries of conversations about the powers of God and also the powers of the devil. Because the devil in the Old Testament is more of a trickster figure. He's there to trick and tempt people for God, but he's not the antithesis of God that he becomes later on in Christianity. That's a New Testament concept, and that's something that it takes years to really establish. So what you see is very sophisticated conversations surrounding demonology going on in the medieval period. Religious leaders are talking about what are the powers of the devil? How can he use these powers and how can they be given to followers? And at the same time, they're really trying to criminalize magic. So, magic that's been used by the populace for a millennia. Since human beings have existed, there have been magical practices, people trying to do X, Y, and Z to get whatever result. So now the church is saying those practices are all demonic, even if you think they're not. Don't use them, even though the populace continues to use them. These two things combine together, late 1300s, early 1400s, and you start to hear conversations about human beings are actually capable of selling their souls to the devil. The devil can actually give them magic powers, and those magic powers are used exclusively to hurt other people. It's centuries in the making, and it actually aligns with, again, throughout human history, we use the same stories to demonize groups who are outsiders over and over again. In the early days of Christianity, those stories were said about Christians, that Christians were cannibals and committing incest and infanticide and just the worst things you can say about a person. Those same stories are used to condemn Jews. Later, they're used to condemn certain Christian groups. And then in the 1400s, when we have this idea of humans being able to make pacts with the devil, those same stories get globbed on. It's the same demonizing stories. So they can make pacts with the devil, and also they kill children, and also they eat children, and they do all these dark things. And that's boom, we've got a witch.
Boom, we've got a witch. Exactly. Okay, so let's talk about these accusations. You said there's a usual suspect. I was going to ask you if men were ever accused of being a witch because I feel like we don't hear about that in culture. So in Salem specifically, who was likely being accused? Who is the person who you're going to get blamed for the crops dying and all that?
The usual suspect, even beyond Salem, it tends to be a typical kind of person. So they're people who push against social boundaries in whatever way. And that actually makes a lot of sense if we think about it logically, right? You're not going to suspect your good friend, your neighbor, the community leader you like and trust and revere. You're not going to suspect them of making a pact with the devil, right? You're going to suspect the people you already disliked, already distrust, already have a bad feeling about. So usually those were the poor, people who went begging house to house and were seen as drains on society. Often they were women who were outspoken. In numerous cases during the Salem Witch Trials, these are women who have histories with publicly fighting with their husbands or their neighbors, who would go house to house begging and would grumble at people if they didn't get what they wanted or if they felt slighted. Sometimes they were people who just have scandal in their past. women who had married beneath their station or had a child outside of marriage. So what you see happening is suspicions are always there, even if they don't result in a witchcraft trial or even a formal accusation. The people have been feeling for years before a witch trial might begin. I think that beggar woman who keeps coming to my door, I bet she's a witch. I can't prove it, but I bet she's a witch. And those feelings get triggered in 1692 during the Salem Witch Trials. And you see all these stories from years past come up of people being like, I knew she was a witch. I've known it for years, and here's why.
Okay, so that makes total sense. Of course, it's people who are on the fringes of society, living a different type of lifestyle, walking the unconventional path. Of course, a woman who speaks her mind in a time where you're supposed to submit. Okay, I'm holding back on my personal feelings about it so we can keep the story going. But okay, so let's say I'm who I see as the evil people in this, somebody who's an accuser. If there's this woman who is driving me crazy, she's outspoken, I don't like her, then my kid gets sick, something bad happens to me, and I want to blame her. What do I do? Do I just run out on my front step and say, this is because of so and so, the witch? How did that process become credible?
Well, so this is actually a really important element of the Salem witch trials because Massachusetts actually had quite a quote unquote good track record with witch trials. They really demanded a strict standard of evidence to prove someone was a witch. So while there are many, many suspicions of witchcraft, and every once in a while that suspicion would escalate to a formal accusation and trial, most of those came to nothing. More often than not, the charges were dropped because you had to be able to really prove it to the magistrates. The most credible way to do that is from a confession, but there were other secondary ways of gathering evidence. But it was very hard to get a Massachusetts court to convict someone of witchcraft. In fact, in the 30 years leading up to the Salem witch trials, only one person was executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts specifically. But during the Salem witch trials, let's remember all that political uncertainty that had been going on for years. They still don't have a charter, which means their legal system's really vulnerable and really tenuous. And people are very, very afraid. So once it's been suggested that the devil really has arrived as these long feared and witches really are here, it leads to this floodgate opening. And I'll always say it, the person most responsible for the Salem witch trials, we love to blame the afflicted girls, right? It was bored teenage girls. They're the ones who caused the Salem witch trials. And while that's not to say the accusers don't have a role, a share of blame, the people who caused the Salem witch trials were the government who decided to ignore past precedent and past procedures. They decided to allow extremely controversial forms of evidence against the advice of the educated men of the colony. They were advised throughout the witch trials not to use these very flimsy forms of evidence. But because the panic is so strong and people are demanding action, they decide to allow that evidence to be used. So, in a previous time, to answer your question, if you wanted to accuse someone of witchcraft, you had to bring it to a magistrate. And by you, I mean a male representative for you, had to bring it to a magistrate. You, the accuser, actually had to post bond. You had to put up some money that said you were going to go through with that accusation. There were then pre-trial examinations. If that felt like there was enough evidence to move forward, you would go before a grand jury, be indicted. Then you would go before a full trial court. It's actually a process that's very similar to our legal procedure today. But during the Salem witch trials, again, they start making all these strange decisions. The first being they don't require the bond payments. So there's no financial incentive to back this accusation. What starts happening? Accusations are being lodged left, right, and center from people, some from the same family over and over and over again. And then they start requiring the bond payment again in July, and accusations slow from those people who had so many accusations before. And then the other really unusual element of the Salem witch trials is while they could examine the accused to see if it's worth going forward, they couldn't actually try them before a court of law until the charter arrived. So for months, people are just in jail waiting because these are capital trials, they're felons. So that you can't try them before the flimsy courts that are in place in the intercharter years. It was too controversial. It was thought the ruling might not stick. So the new charter does arrive in May, but it's like, we got to move fast. We have to move fast. So they just start making incredibly dangerous decisions. And ultimately, all of the people who were executed during the Salem Witch Trials are convicted on evidence that wouldn't have held up before a court of law before the Salem Witch Trials. So, again, familiar stories, familiar paths. When the panic gets to overwhelm the populace, you can let those fears and those demons just take over. And as a result, dangerous decisions are made and people give in to that base instinct to scapegoat, because that's what a witchcraft accusation was. It's a classic example of scapegoating.
It sounds like it. And yeah, then people pay the price, right? Those people who are a little bit different than mainstream society in whatever way, which so many parallels to what was happening then and what is happening now. They pay the price, in this case, the ultimate price of execution.
Right.
So let's talk about this evidence and how they opened up and they were using all of this evidence that maybe wouldn't have flown before. I've heard things about drowning. Do they sink? Do they float? What were the actual tests, if we call them that they were using to say, okay, she is or she isn't?
The swimming story is something that was used during witch trials. It actually wasn't used during the Salem witch trials. It's used in the colonies. There's a case in Virginia. It's just not used in 1692. The most essential evidence that they decided to allow is something called spectral evidence. So this is based on the idea that a witch could theoretically project like a ghostly version of themselves beyond their body. And that ghost can fly miles and miles away, and it can do all kinds of things: bite people, pinch them, prick them. It can conjure ghosts of other loved ones and terribly frightening images. And the only people who can see these spectral apparitions are the victims. So the way that that operates is you have an accuser who's writhing around on the ground screaming, "I see the specter of Sarah Good," let's say. You can't see her, but I can, and that's how I know she's a witch. Now, that sounds strange to us today, right? It sounded strange to people then as well. That was very controversial because the Puritans very much believed that the devil, he's a trickster, he's the king of illusions. It's in the Bible that the devil can conjure the likeness of innocent people. So there's a whole conversation going on in the background of the Salem witch trials about, hey, how do you know that this isn't just the devil impersonating innocent people, or that the accusers are mistaken? And that criticism gets louder and louder as the Salem witch trials go on. But despite the fact that the magistrates are warned repeatedly about this, it's the evidence they have against almost every single person who's been accused. So without that spectral testimony, almost all of the cases are going to fall apart immediately. And they have this witchcraft crisis on their hands. They feel like they have to do something. So they decide that they're going to allow the spectral evidence. And it's something that's regretted by many people immediately. So there's actually letters and statements written by some of the jury members, by at least one of the former judges, saying, "We made a mistake. The fear of the day took over, and I would take it back if I could now." And that's only a couple years after the Salem witch trials.
Wow. That's amazing that people had that regret and remorse. It's never depicted that way either. I see almost the entire city of Salem as this angry mob, and they're just picking out interesting, intuitive women and murdering them, essentially. So it sounds like the tone in reality of the people, the general populace, was maybe a little bit more mixed, but still gave in to that fear.
Yeah, definitely as time goes on, especially towards the beginning of the panic, there's very few voices criticizing what's going on. But again, they're not accusing people who are particularly controversial. And there are some exceptions to that in the early days, Rebecca Nurse being the most famous. But as time goes on and more people get pulled in, get accused of witchcraft, have relatives accused of witchcraft, one of the really interesting and again, very relatable things about the Salem witch trials is it often took an accusation touching your own life for you to realize that something was wrong. Truly. And that's what we see with a lot of the elite men running the show, where their mother is accused or the spectral apparition of their wife is cited. And they say, wait. My wife, my mother, myself, I know that we're not witches. So if I can be accused, maybe there is something wrong here. And that's not to say that every person was remorseful afterwards. There are plenty of people who went to their graves saying that what they did during the Salem witch trials was necessary and it protected people. It was a protective measure. But in 1711, there are actually reparation payments awarded by the government. They acknowledge the innocence of a number of the people who were convicted, legally clear their charges, and give reparation payments to the families. So that right there is very telling of the environment of the aftermath. It's very clear that something terrible had happened and innocent people had been hurt in 1692.
That is just so classic human nature, unfortunately, to be like, no, 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 this is good. These people are bad until it's you, it's your sister, it's your best friend. And then it's, oh my gosh, no, wait, never mind. We just have this disconnect, which is so infuriating. And all I can think about now is parallels to things that are happening in our current environment.
That's the frustrating part about being a historian always is humans are very repetitive creatures. History really does move in a cyclical nature often. We just repeat the same patterns over and over again. It's only by learning about this and taking the Salem witch trials out of the context of this weird thing that happened 300 plus years ago that's wrapped up in the supernatural and so different from us today. That's not a helpful way to learn about the Salem witch trials. And in fact, it's disrespectful to the people who were involved to strip it down that way. We have more in common with them than we like to admit. And that's the most important thing to remember when we're talking about the Salem witch trials.
Okay, let's start talking about this transference from what was happening then to current society. So, I wanted to ask you about the pop culture around witches and somebody who really understands this. And as you said, there is a respect. These were real people who were executed during the witch trials. And I would say, from my perspective, it doesn't know that much, 100% in the wrong, right? How many of these people actually did anything? Maybe none of them. But when we think about witches now, and I mentioned Hocus Pocus, Practical Magic, Wizard of Oz, I guess first, how did we get there to these very specific caricatures of a hat and a look and a vibe? And how do you feel about that as somebody who's in touch with the reality?
Yeah, so my answer is actually going to be very surprising. I don't think there's anything wrong with that because it is what it is. Witchcraft is a very bizarre subject to study because it's based in this incredibly dark, violent, tragic history. But then we stop believing in the supernatural in that way. Witchcraft enters folklore and fairy tales, and it becomes something else entirely in the public mind. And I truly can't think of another tragic historical event that has this same evolution. So once legal witch trials come to an end, as I said, this memory lingers with us. So witch trials are ending in the 1700s, right? That's when legal witch trials come to an end. Witchcraft is decriminalized throughout Europe slowly throughout this period. As we enter the 1800s, we start to see refined stereotypes of the witch, much of them based in older beliefs surrounding witches. So we won't go through the whole stereotype, but witches being able to fly is something that's brought up regularly during witch trials. There was no consensus about how they did this. So depending on where you are and what time period you're in during the European witch trials, some people say witches fly on broomsticks. Some people say it's backwards on goats. Some people say they fly through the air supported by nothing at all. In Salem, the story was they flew on sticks or poles. And some people said witches can't actually fly. That would be ridiculous. They think they're flying, they're dreaming, and in their minds, they're going out and meeting with the devil and doing all this stuff. So over time, just one of those stories gets absorbed into public memory. Why it is the broomstick, there's different speculations about it. Honestly, it could have been a stick, it could have been backwards on a goat. It just happens to be the broomstick. And if you pick apart the stereotypical witch, the Hansel and Gretel witch, the whole thing comes from the European witch trials. But as time then continues to go on, again, we start to forget about the crime of witchcraft and the real people who were accused of being witches, and witches become this mythic creature. They get refined down to just a woman who has supernatural powers. And again, witches are almost always women, right? Because women were accused at such a high rate during the witch trials. So you start to see if a man has similar supernatural powers, they're a wizard or a warlock. They're rarely described as a witch. A witch is a woman and almost always an older, haggard, scary woman, right? But then as time goes on, culture starts to play with that idea. Maybe it's not an old, scary woman. Maybe it's a beautiful young woman. Maybe it's a woman who's actually a hero in the story. Maybe they're using their magic for good. So that idea gets traction in 1900 with the publication The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. L. Frank Baum's story has two good witches, Glinda and the Good Witch of the North, who are separate characters. There's a whole interesting backstory with his mother-in-law, who is like a leading member of the first wave feminist movement and had written about the history of witchcraft. And that's a whole other side topic. There is an argument to be made that that influences the way he starts writing about witches. And from the 20th century on, of course, that idea just becomes huge. And it arguably starts to dominate the witch. Witches are actually good, relatable, beautiful characters. By the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, they're coming of age figures. A girl turns 13 and has magic powers now, and it's a metaphor for adolescence. It becomes very intrinsically connected to women and female empowerment, and it just keeps growing. I always say people come to Salem today, and it's a little jarring, right, to see hocus pocus and people dressed in witch hats and the pop culture witch around the city as well. It's a very tricky subject, but I always say that Salem didn't invent that. It happened naturally, and it's just part of our cultural memory. The witch exists on this long continuum, and it's up to each individual person. You can engage with the pop culture witch. In fact, it would be weird if we didn't, right? Kids grow up wanting to be witches for Halloween. I was a witch for Halloween as a child, loving the Harry Potter series or Wicked or whatever. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But it's important to keep the real tragic history in mind and not cross the line into making fun of that history as well. So it's a very tricky, big subject. We have our work cut out for us here in Salem. And I won't lie and say every person in Salem has nailed that balance. It's an evolving topic for us here in Salem, Massachusetts.
It's complicated. I mean, you're doing an amazing job. What you're doing here, sharing this real history with us and also not condemning us if we love to watch Hocus Pocus 18 times every October.
I love to watch Hocus Pocus too.
It's so good. And yeah, I guess as somebody who grew up in the 80s and 90s, I've always thought of witches as something cool that I revere. And of course, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, as you mentioned, these coming age things, watching reruns of Bewitched. And when I was doing prep for this episode and I was thinking about all the pop culture things that are happening now and the phenomenon of Wicked and how witches have never been more widely accepted and revered, and I'm sure it will be the costume of all costumes this Halloween season. And I was talking with my producer and she was like, yeah, you could ask something about how calling somebody a witch is an insult. Oh, she's such a witch. And honestly, I had forgotten that. I know people do that, but I was like, that's true, but that's insane. I would never call someone, not that I want to insult women in general, but that doesn't even come into my mind. A witch isn't an insult. A witch is a compliment. Whatever it means to you, I see it as a positive thing. So it's very fascinating that, as you have taught us, witches have been part of the story of history for probably a lot longer than we realized. And we've been in this era, at least from my perspective, where it's much more fun and play and imagination, not at all putting them down, but maybe I'm just sheltered.
No, I think that the witch has really become an empowering figure for women. And that's true. We talked a little bit about the modern religious identity of witches. There's nuance to it, right? Men are accused of witchcraft as well. It's not always rebellious, unusual women, but many of them are. And people really find that resonates with them. And it's this empowering thing to take back the word witch and say, you know what? I'm a mouthy woman. I'm a woman who is pushing against social boundaries in whatever way. And I find this figure meaningful to me. And it's become a religious identity, a really beautiful one that, as we talked about, has nothing to do with the devil or the crime of witchcraft. It's something else entirely. And it's just continuing to grow. It's become a political rallying cry as well. During the Me Too movement, there were a lot of signs referencing, we are the daughters of the witches you didn't burn. That's not new. That was happening during second wave feminism, first wave feminism. The witch is a relatable figure still. So it's a very complicated subject. And I love what you said. I always think of the witch in terms of it means something different to every person. But it's funny you say that you wouldn't find being called a witch offensive. Something that we do experience here at the museum, not as frequently in recent years, I will say, but we do experience is a group of people will come in And it's always a middle-aged dad says, "Oh, I'm here with my witches," or "Do I get free admission because I'm married to a witch?" It means something different to every person, right? That connotation of the witch, unfortunately, still exists. So it's a big, broad subject that just continues evolving.
Oh my gosh, it's so cool. Okay, so I want to talk more about the takeaways. And as you said, the most important thing that we remember is the fact that we're not that different from what was happening and the way people were behaving in the 1690s. But before we do that, are there any standout stories? You've mentioned a couple names. I'm not familiar with individuals who were part of the witch trials. Are there specific stories or things that you like to share or that you have found particularly meaningful about your studying?
Well, I think just the human element of it is really powerful. The education department, which is myself and one other person, we have been doing a project for probably about 5 years now. They're called descendant packets. So they're resource packets for people who can trace their ancestry to the Salem Witch Trials. We have a lot of people who are self identified descendants who come to the museum looking for resources and help. So it started as this, oh, we'll make these packets that include a short bio and books related to that person, sites related to that person, documents related to that person, like a one stop shop if you want to learn about your ancestor. As time has gone on, this project has gotten way out of control. Our assistant education director, Jill, and I just can't help ourselves because once you start researching these people, you get so into the story. So these short biographies have now become incredibly long, detailed biographies. But the interesting part about this is we started it writing about just the 20 people who were executed, who are, of course, some of the most famous people associated with witch panic. But now we've expanded it to include people who were accused and lived, but also accusers, magistrates, ministers, the people who supported the witch trials and pushed them forward. And writing those packets, whenever we pick a new person, you go into it like, I hate this person. I'm not going to feel any empathy for this person. I don't want to write this person. Every time I have taken on one of those projects, as has Jill, you come out with not necessarily liking them, but at least understanding them. Because when you really start to focus on a person, they make a lot more sense. So, for example, the Putnam family, they're some of the lead accusers during the Salem Witch Trials. That family I mentioned who got really overly excited by not having to pay bond, that's the Putnams. They're the chief accusers. So it's a father, a wife, and their 12-year-old daughter and the family's servant, people in the household who were making the accusations. There are other kids who live in the house as well who do not get involved in the witch trials. But Ann Putnam Jr. is 12 years old. She is one of the most active accusers. And we think of her in public memory as this evil child. How could she do this? How could she murder all of these people? Her name is on the indictments of a huge number of people. But then when you really start to dig into her story and the story of her mother, who's also an accuser, you really start to get this sense of they're a nuanced person. And yeah, they might just be an evil person and they wanted to kill people. But more likely, it seems like they're reacting to the environment around them. Maybe they really did fear these people were witches. In Anne's case, maybe she is being forced or controlled by the adults around her, especially the accusers. We tend to, again, just say that these crazy teenage girls caused the Salem witch trials, but they're nuanced individuals too. And Ann Putnam Jr. is an example of she apologizes for her role as a grown adult. She says, I'm sorry for what happened. I think Rebecca Nurse, who's one of the victims, was innocent, and I'm sorry for the role I played in her death. So I think that we could talk about the victims all day, and I would love to. Their stories are incredibly important, rich sources. But it's equally important to remember the accusers and to not fully demonize them. There are no villains in the story of the Salem witch trials, as strange as that sounds. Every person is a person of their time. And I mean, it depends on if you're a pessimist or an optimist, but to me, none of them are just acting out of evil impulses. They all have reasons for what they're doing and at certain times come to their senses. Not all of them, but some of them do. And it's a very telling look into human behavior.
That's really grounding to remember. And I even went into this thinking, oh, I just feel so sorry for these women who were killed. And as I've said, I don't believe they did anything. And the way evidence was considered, there's no grounds to just murder these people. So, of course, my bias is to be against whoever made those decisions or accused them. But I think the danger in doing that when we fast forward to today and everything that's happened between from the 1690s to today, there's so many tragedies of humanity. And there's always somebody who's perpetrating these offenses. And then there's victims who pay the price. So I think we run the risk of distancing ourselves too much from the quote unquote villain when we just see them as, oh my gosh, this insane evil woman and her weird little daughter who sent all these women to their death. I hate them. I'm so different from them. That's where we go next, right? I could never. That's the problem. And then you look around in modern times, which whatever is happening now is a different situation, but the themes are the same. And we can talk about other things with slavery and the Holocaust and these things that just come to mind immediately as mass tragedies. When we think, I could never, that would never be me, then we run the risk of being a little bit blind to the self-awareness of the part we all play and whatever's happening in the time that we're alive.
I think that that's so beautifully said, and you get an A+ for your Salem Witch Trials history. It's true. I really think that that's the key, right? When we start to caricature the events, the heroes and the villains, that's when we've lost the thread of the humanity behind all of it.
What do you want people to know? You've obviously dedicated so much time in your career to being in this position and being in Salem and educating people on this. What do you wish people would take away the most when they visit or when they just hear you on the show?
It's the tendency to scapegoat. I write our docent script for our exhibit here, and I've really just laid into scapegoating in the last couple of years, especially. We sound like a broken clock, but it's a compulsion. It's an enduring human compulsion. It's been happening long before witch trials began. It's happened ever since they came to an end. It's this feeling that when you think your world is out of control, you feel powerless or threatened or scared, and you're worried about yourself and your family. I don't want my family to be hurt. You lash out around you and you say, you know what? If I can find the source of the problem, my life is going to start to get better. And you start to point fingers at people you already dislike or distrust. That is the basis of scapegoating. That's the basis of historic witch hunts. So I always say when people are studying witch trials, drawn in by the history of magic and how fantastical that sounds, it's such an interesting, strange subject to us. But it's just remembering that no person was a witch in Salem or during the witch trials period. These were all innocent people who became scapegoats. And there was often remorse after they were gone. Not always, but that's clear. That lesson of it wouldn't be me, I wouldn't do it, I wouldn't turn away even. That's the core lesson to take away from the Salem witch trials is scapegoating is going to continue. Just because we're not living in 1692 or the early modern period doesn't mean that we've gotten away from the witch trials.
As a historian, what makes you optimistic about the future? What are you excited about? What makes you feel good and hopeful?
I've had this conversation more often with visitors recently. The witch trials period, the early modern period, is referred to by some historians as an age of anxiety because there's a lot going wrong in Europe all at one time. And I've had a couple people laughing in tours recently because it's relatable, right? It feels like now is an age of anxiety. The thing that makes me optimistic as a historian is that history really does act like a pendulum. You swing one way, but then it always swings back. It often takes time, it takes years, it takes decades, but it has always swung back. So, unless we're truly living at the end of days, humans, though we have these tendencies to give in to scapegoating and panic and mass hysteria, we always snap out of it. We always have before. And that's something that really gives me hope. Something like the Salem witch trials could happen and people could snap out of it. And not only snap out of it, but realize in their lifetime that a grave injustice had occurred. So that's what I hold on to as a historian. And I feel like the pendulum will swing back. It always has. And I do feel like it always will.
And the education that you're providing, I think helps that happen sooner, right? Hopefully, us just stepping into the shoes of these people in the past just a little bit, just for 45 minutes today, whatever it takes, whatever interests us. I think that starts to crack open our psyche a little bit and maybe just press pause and look at what we're doing and pay attention to who things are being done to today. And hopefully that can speed up that process and things don't have to get so bad before we swing the other way. That's what I think about.
Yeah, the hope is that it doesn't have to go as far as touching your own life to recognize it, right? Because that is unfortunately sometimes the case. But the hope is that talking about this and reminding ourselves of the parallels, it's easy to scapegoat. It makes you feel good and empowered. You have control in a situation that's beyond your control. It's way easier to just give in and go with the crowd. And we should remember during witch trials, the people who stood up before the tide had shifted and criticized what was happening, they were in danger. Oftentimes, those people were accused of being witches and arrested. It is dangerous to speak out and talk about it when the public mood has not yet shifted. But the only way to prevent things like this from happening in the future and in the present moment is to continue talking about it and just continue having these conversations.
Hopefully, we can all be on that side of actually standing up, even when it's hard. And there's safety in numbers and community and rallying around each other when it's so hard to do that stuff by yourself. Rachel, for everybody who has loved learning from you and wants to learn more, what's the best place to connect with you? And can you give us any hot tips? I know I want to go to Salem, and a lot of my friends have either been or we all want to go together. So, what time of year do we go? Do you have any hot tips to leave us with?
If you're interested in following the museum, we have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and a pitiful Blue Sky account. It's at Salem Witch Museum on all those platforms. So that's where you can see what we're doing, collection updates, things like that. We also offer free virtual programming throughout the year. We try to make as much of it free as possible. So we actually earlier this year did a whole event about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law, who's the famous feminist who may have inspired the Good Witches in the Wizard of Oz. That lecture was recorded. It's on our virtual archive, which is at salemwitchmuseum.com on our virtual archive page. So I always say, if you want to keep up with the museum, follow us on those places. In terms of coming to Salem, you can come in the fall, but I always say that if you're going to come in the fall, do the special event things and come very prepared. Come early in the morning so you can find a parking spot and just enjoy the fall atmosphere. There's lots of vendor fairs and special events and stuff like that. But if you don't like crowds, do not come, because the city every year gets a little bit more crowded. Last year, over 1 million people came in the month of October alone. Salem is a city of 45,000 residents. So it's a little crazy. It's fun. There's people in costumes everywhere. It's quite a fall festival we have here. But if you want to come and do the museums and see the memorials, take your time. The spring is really the best time to come. Things are starting to open back up. A lot of places close in the winter, but it's not crowded yet. The summer, it does start to get busy. So you can walk around, and Salem is a seaside city. So you get to have your lovely time strolling around, seeing the water, eating at the seafood restaurants, and also coming into all the museums. Salem's got an incredibly rich history, a history of piracy and witchcraft and Revolutionary War connections. It's crazy how much history is in Salem. So I recommend everybody comes at some point, but maybe not in October.
1 million people is overwhelming. That's a lot for a town of that size. I'm sure it's like a blessing and a curse in some ways to have all those people at once.
That is exactly what it is.
Well, thank you for the inside scoop. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. I feel educated and inspired, and I just really appreciate your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a really fun, really important conversation, and I hope it sparks some interest with the Salem Witch Trials.
I'm sure that it will. Thank you for listening. I would love for you to keep exploring with me. Check out the bonus episode on Substack and come hang out on Instagram for some October fun. Until next week, keep leaning into mystery, wonder, and of course, let's stay curious together.